Good evening. I'm Paul Carisse. I'm the director of this new academic department at Arizona State University, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, and I am very glad that you could join us for the first event in our new academic year, 2019-2020, and this is our third year as an academic unit at Arizona State University. And another first, this is the first time that we've partnered with a local civic institution for a speaker event, and we're very happy to be working with the Goldwater Institute, named for a great Arizonan and an American statesman. And we're also glad to have Barry Goldwater Jr. With us here in the audience. Now, in the choreography for tonight's event, I will introduce the president of the Institute, who in turn will introduce our special guest, who some of you just saw enter the room, a notable Arizona State University alum, and he in turn will introduce our main speaker. And so, Robby, this should all the introductions should be done in about an hour, and then you'll get on the stage before midnight, I think. After Robby's presentation, I will return to the stage here to moderate the question and answer period. That kind of a question and answer conversation with the speaker is a feature of all of our public speaker events. So, as you're enjoying tonight's presentation, do be thinking of questions you might like to pose. We hope you've picked up some literature on the school on the way in to learn about our undergraduate curriculum, which connects the classical liberal arts tradition with civic education, all to prepare students to think about service and leadership in the public sector, in the private sector, civil society, public affairs. We now have a major and a minor. We're just launching our first master's degree, which is directed toward classical school teachers and homeschooling community, called Classical Liberal Education and Leadership. Tonight's event is also something of a warm-up for the first event in our major speaker series for 2019-2020. This year, we've picked the theme, Citizenship and Civic Leadership in America. That series will begin on September 25th, with Harvard professor Robert Putnam, addressing the topic of America's fraying civic fabric and how to reweave or renew a common civic community. This is the third year of our series. We're again grateful to have as ASU co-sponsors the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law and the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. We're also continuing our partnership with Arizona PBS, which records our major speaker events and produces their own episodes to broadcast on Channel 8 locally. All of our speaker events, the major series events and the two annual lectures we have, every fall in September a Constitution Day lecture, and every January a Martin Luther King Day lecture or speaker event. All of those are archived on the school's website, which is SCETL as our acronym. And you should also check out our podcast, which is linked on the website, and that's based on our speaker series. We call that Keeping It Civil. There are conversations with several of our diverse array of speakers who we bring in to ASU. The aim of all of this, our speakers program as a civic education program, is to provide a public forum for civil disagreement and debate on important academic and civic issues. So just coming ahead this semester, in October, we'll have David Leonhardt here of the New York Times in conversation with Ramesh Ponnuru, writing for the National Review. In November, we have a dialogue event with the rival campaign leaders for last year's Arizona gubernatorial election. And then in January, we have a tentative commitment from Senator Sinema, another distinguished ASU alum, to speak in a Women in Leadership series that is organized by one of our two centers, the Center for Political Thought and Leadership. Various local and national voices have commended the school for establishing this new prominent space at ASU for civil discourse and disagreement on important topics. And so I'm glad to see an array of people here from ASU and from the broader community, civic leaders and citizens with us. I'm also grateful that the dean of our college, of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Dr. Pat Kenny, could be with us tonight. So now to briefly introduce the leader of our partner institution for this event, Mr. Victor Riches, who is the president and CEO of the Goldwater Institute. The Institute is a leading free market public policy research and litigation organization founded in 1988 with Senator Barry Goldwater's blessing. The Institute focuses on advancing the principles of limited government, economic freedom, and individual liberty. Victor came to the Goldwater Institute after extensive experience in Arizona government, both the legislature and the governor's office. He served as the chief of staff for both the state Senate and the House of Representatives, and then he served as Governor Ducey's deputy chief of staff for policy and budget. So please join me in welcoming Victor Riches.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. And it is really great to be back here at ASU, the school that I graduated from. And so thank you all for joining us this evening. And I would be remiss if I didn't start by just mentioning that our keynote speaker tonight was once an intern at the Goldwater Institute. And so it's been a true pleasure to see Robby truly emerge as one of this country's greatest defenders of free speech and common sense on college campuses. So Robby, I think we all owe you a great debt of gratitude. Thank you for all the great work you're doing. And truly, I wish we had 1,000 more people just like you out there. People ask me all the time, what is the greatest threat facing us today? And I believe, without a doubt, it is the constant attacks on the First Amendment, which is why protecting free speech on college campuses and beyond is so vitally important. Because the second you turn your back on the First Amendment, all of the rest of our constitutional protections, all of those protections that we all hold so dear, simply fall by the wayside. And I know this is also a top priority of the man I'm about to introduce, because we've worked very closely with Governor Ducey over the past few years to pass measures to protect commercial free speech in medicine, donor privacy, and most importantly, groundbreaking legislation, both in Arizona and other states, to ensure free speech on our college campuses. Thanks to the governor's leadership, Arizona now has some of the strongest across-the-board First Amendment protections anywhere in the country. And so it is a real honor for me to introduce my former boss, a great friend, and a true ally in defense of free speech, Governor Doug Ducey.
I want to say thank you very much, Victor, for the generous introduction, for your great service to the state and your stewardship and leadership of the Goldwater Institute. It's a thrill for me to be here tonight. I want to thank ASU for having me in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, or as it's affectionately known on our senior staff, the SCETL School. I want to thank the Goldwater Institute for partnering with our special guest, Robby Soave, and I know I'm the only thing that stands between your enjoyment of Robby and tonight, so I will be brisk. On this note, I want to express the appreciation of the great work that the Goldwater Institute has done for 30-plus years, and say I couldn't be more proud to be leading a state that is associated with Barry Goldwater and what he stood for in the conservative cause. I don't think it's any surprise that so many of today's brightest thought leaders are accounted among your alumni, including tonight's special guest. Robby Soave continues to shine as a beacon of common sense reporting in his role as associate editor at Reason.com, where he writes on everything from education policy to criminal justice reform. I want the young people to know how I know Robby Soave. I know him through his work. Before I ever met him, I was reading the pieces that he produced. He most recently caught my attention as someone who broke through the mainstream media narrative and reported the real story about the incidents involving students from Covington Catholic in Washington, D.C. And in 2014, the first time I was introduced to his work, when he was 25 years old, Robby was among the first journalists to out the inconsistencies in a Rolling Stone magazine article about assault on campus, which changed the culture on campuses across the country, and he led to the story's retraction. Today, at just 30 years young, Robby Soave is an example to the millennial generation of what it takes to make a difference the right way. He puts in the hard work and does the fundamentals. He asks the right questions. He does the research. He articulates clearly and isn't afraid to take a stand in the face of pressure. And that's precisely what Robby has done with his new book, Panic Attack. We're so glad to have him with us tonight. He's a model of excellence in his chosen profession. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm Arizona welcome to Robby Soave.
Well, that's a lot for me to live up to, but thank you so much for the warm introduction. I have to begin by thanking a number of people. First, the governor, of course, who has done so much terrific work, both in the public sector and in the private sector. I recently learned that you were the CEO of Cold Stone, where my wife and I, when she was my girlfriend, I think we ate probably 1,000 Oreo Overlords and birthday cake remixes, and she is my wife now. And also the work your office has done on occupational licensing reform, which is a cause very important to us libertarians who think probably you should be able to open up a business to blow dry people's hair without the permission of the government. You shouldn't need that. So, wonderful. I also, of course, have to thank the Goldwater Institute for sponsoring this event, and beyond that, for mentoring me at a very pivotal moment in my career. I was actually first becoming interested in the culture of higher education, the funding of higher education, what was happening on college campuses, right after I graduated when I was an intern at Goldwater, and I learned so much from the staff there, from the investigative reporter on staff about the tools of journalism, how to use the public record system, things of that nature. So it was a wonderful program. It has helped me immeasurably. I also want to thank ASU, particularly the School of, I'm going to have to read it, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, which is trying to restore, to bring back exactly the kind of difficult conversations between people who disagree but disagree thoughtfully, and allowing them to interact and to have people learn from their discussions. This is exactly what a college campus is supposed to be about, and this exchange of ideas has been lost in all too many elite educational institutions. That's exactly the thing that my book is about, that I'm going to get into. But it's wonderful to see ASU being one of the institutions that is resisting that trend and trying to bring back exactly this type of dialogue. So I'm so thrilled and honored to speak to you on that front. And also I want to thank my mother for being in attendance today. I'm so happy to have her with me. All right, so I am here to discuss my book, Panic Attack, Young Radicals in the Age of Trump, which is my attempt to grapple with a phenomenon that probably many of you have taken notice of. It's difficult to ignore at times, which is the climate of hostility to certain principles that I believe in very strongly as libertarian, but also liberals, classical liberals, kind of our entire Enlightenment tradition was built around things like free speech and due process that used to be so vital to the left, that have been increasingly under attack, not just on college campuses, although that's where some of the most glaring examples have presented themselves, and I'll get into a few of them in a moment, but also off campus, also on social media, in the private business place, in the world of government. The drive to cancel people, to get them fired or run out of public society for having said something that offends you, even if it was unintentional, even if you misinterpreted it and it wasn't meant to trigger you at all. That drive to destroy people for menial sins, for small issues, has migrated, I think, from the college campus, where a small number of very radical students have prevented conservative speakers from coming to campus. They prevented their own, actually often very stridently progressive professors from instructing them, because they'll say something that the students object to, and then there will be an investigation, and the professors are, I'm afraid, learning that they have to shut up out of a risk of offending perhaps one person in the classroom. But as I said, I've seen this migrate off the campus. In fact, just this week, just yesterday, I think, Leif Olson, who was a appointee to the Labor Department, I see some of you nodding your heads, you probably already read about this. He was a Labor Department official, and there was a Bloomberg Law article about how he had written this horribly anti-Semitic Facebook post years ago in reference to Paul Ryan, the former Speaker of the House. Of course, the Facebook post is making fun of anti-Semites. He's writing as if how would the anti-Semite write about Paul Ryan. It's very clear he supports Paul Ryan wildly, and he's making fun of people who don't like Jewish people. He is not one of them himself, an anti-Semite. Of course, this nuance was either lost to the Bloomberg law reporter, or then the person just didn't care once it was pointed out to him. And this piece came out attacking this official, who then had to resign from his post. Although I will have an update to that later in my remarks. But that kind of trend to destroy people over things they've said, unintentional slight harms, has migrated outward from the campus. And that my book largely discusses the kinds of activists who have, and each reason that they have sought to engage in this canceling or this censoring. A few more examples to show to you that this really is a problem. My book was initially pitched after an incident at Yale that probably many of you are familiar with, but there a dean of Yale's college was, so first his wife, so first the campus sent guidance relating to Halloween costumes, warning the students, well, be careful what you wear on Halloween. We wouldn't want to offend anyone or scare them, God forbid, on Halloween. Anyone be scared. So then the dean, Nicholas Christakis, his wife, thought this guidance was heavy-handed, maybe a little paternalistic. Maybe the students who are 18, 19, 20 years old do not need to be told what to wear for Halloween anymore. This was the advice given out by Christakis' wife, who's a teacher at Yale. So soon after, Christakis was confronted in the public square by several dozen militant progressive students who berated him for hours because his wife had sent out this message. They said, "No, you are wrong. It is indeed your role. It is explicitly your job to protect us from discomfort, however slight, however only relating to our emotional state. That is explicitly your job. You are our stand-in father figure." And Christakis tried to protest that he sees his role as fostering an intellectual space on campus, a space for people to disagree or even to offend or bother each other. And they said, no, that is not your role. Your role is to create a safe space for us. And it was a sort of perfect, I think, articulation of this new value among some progressive students at many of our most elite institutions of higher learning. There was another incident at Middlebury College where there was supposed to be a debate between Charles Murray, who's a conservative scholar, and Alison Stanger, who's a liberal economist. They were actually going to have a debate. Of course, the debate could not take place because a small number of students shouted over them until the event had to be canceled. They then followed Murray and Stanger to their cars, and they attacked. I mean that quite literally. They put Alison Stanger in a neck brace. They sent her to the hospital because they were going to have a discussion that included Charles Murray's perspective, which is so threatening to people, even to hear his words, that they felt justified in using violence to prevent a discussion of these ideas. Similar things have happened to other conservative speakers like Ben Shapiro, Heather McDonald, Christina Hoff Sommers, but by no means is this canceling only targeting people on the right. In fact, I interviewed for my book many professors who are people of the left, who are of an older left mindset, maybe an ACLU mindset, where they value free speech very much, but they're stridently progressive people. And yet they think because they are somehow out of step with the current climate of activism, that if they said something or used the wrong pronouns or used the wrong words or expressed a view about sex or gender that is progressive but is somehow in disagreement with the students, there would be investigations, there could be firings. This is what happened to Laura Kipnis, who is a professor at Northwestern College, who actually all she did was write an article saying that the policies related to sexual harassment on campus, she thought they were overly broad and shouldn't be enforced and there was something wrong with them. These policies are called Title IX. Her students filed a complaint that she had written this article, alleging that Title IX forbids criticism, essentially, of Title IX. It's reminiscent of Catch-22. If you've read Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, it is exactly that same sort of ethos. So she was investigated at great length for violating Title IX by criticizing it. In this process, she was not afforded a lawyer, but the university assigned her or allowed her to have a support person. But her support person, which is kind of a euphemistic way of, but her support person, this person's advocacy on her behalf also generated Title IX complaints. So then he was moved off the case and had his own sort of trial. You know, the university spent hundreds of thousands of dollars adjudicating this matter. I can only imagine, and some of the people here are administrators in higher ed, so they would probably back me up on this. I can only imagine the compliance cost of adjudicating all these demands of students, some of them, again, quite trivial, has to be astronomical and is part of if we're filling in the picture of why dear Lord, tuition has increased so dramatically over the last 20 years. Certainly the cost of flying in a legal team to determine whether a professor had a right to criticize a campus policy has to be part of the picture. Another leftist professor to run afoul of the climate of censorship on campuses is someone I admire a great deal, Brett Weinstein, who was a professor at Evergreen College I believe in Washington State. And again, he was a figure of the left who was very sympathetic to his activist students. Every year, the activist students would have a day of protest where they left campus, and he was wholly supportive of their efforts. But this year being 2 years ago, they said, no, we're going to stay on campus and we want everyone else to leave. And Brett Weinstein said, well, while I support your goals, I'm still going to teach my class today. That was a no-no. The protesting devolved onto him. And it soon became clear, actually, the campus authorities, the police officers, told Brett Weinstein and his wife, who were both teachers at Evergreen, that they could no longer guarantee their safety because there were students walking around the campus with bats who were out to get them. And so they both had to leave the college. This is an extreme example, but there are, and for every extreme example, I worry and suspect, based on my conversations with professors, that there are 100 or 1,000 more professors who you didn't hear about it, it didn't make the news, but they just decided to remain quiet in their classroom because that was easier than trying to argue with or educate their students about something they would disagree with. I've learned from professors of law that they've actually stopped teaching the law as it relates to sexual assault because they would be afraid that someone in the classroom would file a complaint saying you have called to mind my past trauma if they were a person or a survivor of sexual assault, which I'm sure is a well-intended thing to do, but you would create the situation where people are coming out of law schools without the ability to adjudicate these matters or to know how we should sensitively apply the law in order to support victims, which would be a terrible setback for actually taking allegations of sexual assault seriously if we could no longer teach how to handle it because we were afraid of re-traumatizing someone in the classroom. That's the kind of madness that grows out of this new culture that we must self-censor or prevent speech that is uncomfortable, and if we do not do so, it is a matter of safety. So those are there are new there are new incidents, of course, every day. I've recently become furious with Harvard, which is, you know, by some counts the most elite institution of education in the world. Harvard has mounted what can only be described as all-out war on the concepts of free speech and due process on an administrative level. There was a law professor there who was a faculty of a residential college who is again a person of the left who is an expert on criminal justice reform. This man, his name is Ron Sullivan. He advised Senator Obama before Senator Obama became President Obama on criminal justice issues. He has helped free hundreds of wrongfully incarcerated people. This is a figure progressives ought to admire. And as part of his belief that even reprehensible people have rights and should be represented in the legal system, a belief, by the way, that what John Adams had when he represented the people, the alleged perpetrators of the Boston Massacre. So this is a belief with a long, proud tradition in American jurisprudence in the Enlightenment tradition that Sullivan believes in as a man of the left. Of course, recently, Ron Sullivan was going to briefly represent Harvey Weinstein, the accused Hollywood director who's accused of very credible, horrific allegations of sexual assault. It had never been a problem before when he represented accused murderers, accused terrorists, but now he was representing someone who's at this kind of cultural moment, and a small number of student activists demanded immediately that he be fired because his just representing this person made the campus an unsafe place. Harvard agreed to conduct an investigation, and within a few weeks, they fired him as faculty dean. I was glad to see that the ACLU, which I've had some criticisms with, I think they've been walking back from some of their historical free speech and due process commitments. That's up for debate. But they put out a statement just condemning Harvard for having dealt this serious blow to the principle of due process. So I hope I have persuaded you at least that there is a problem. Again, this is not every campus. This is not every young person. There are many young people in the audience. I'm, by some stretches of the imagination, a fellow young person. I think most members of my generation and the generation to come are thoughtful, interesting, entrepreneurial people who are interested in hearing different ideas and want to get an experience out of college where they're exposed to different ideas. So the problem is not a generational problem. The problem is a small number, a radical cabal, thus the subhead of my book, who have gained some degree of power on campuses in just the last few years and have been able to hijack the conversation at places like Harvard and Yale and Middlebury and Evergreen to a remarkable degree that ought to concern us, given the positions of power these people will go on to occupy in our society, on Wall Street, at social media companies, in government, and so on. So for my book, I tried to understand where this was coming from. So I did a lot of research, a lot of conversations with young people. I went to a lot of events. I showed up when Charles Murray was there to speak to see if he'd get shouted down and to ask the people who were shouting him down, why are you doing this? Why do you think this is a good idea? And I would pose the question to them, don't you think if you're not letting someone speak, you make yourself look kind of foolish or kind of overly sensitive? You play into the fragile, delicate snowflake trope, and you make people more sympathetic to the person you're shutting down. There's actually good social science research that shutdown tactics backfire, that resistance that is uncivil or illiberal tends to make people more sympathetic to like authoritarian ideas. Richard Nixon in the 1960s was handed a note by an aide who said, sorry, sir, we understand there are going to be a lot of campus protests coming up this year. And Richard Nixon, of course, said, good, knowing that those kinds of things would make most people, the moderate masses, more sympathetic to the kinds of law and order policies he wanted to implement. And of course, at the time, Nixon was a figure. He was despised by the campus left in the California colleges, a left that used to be so much more all about free speech. Berkeley actually led the free speech movement in 1963. You would not believe the restrictive policies that were in place at that campus and many others back then. So you were not allowed, no student was allowed to organize on behalf of a political cause unless it was narrowly related to the university, like putting different vending machines in the cafeteria or something, or student government elections, the worst kind of election of all. And they couldn't bring outside speakers to talk at all, or they had to go through the administration. So the leftist students furiously resisted this. They said, absolutely not. We have a First Amendment right to organize on behalf of whatever cause we want and to bring whatever speakers we want. And the only authority that can limit that is the Supreme Court, which is the correct view. And that was the view of the left student leader Mario Savio, who kicked off this movement that eventually did result in the policies being repealed. And the left at the time was so committed to free speech that I kid you not, I discovered this in my research for the book, that they hosted a a string of deliberately very not conservative, very controversial speakers, including an actual Nazi in 1963. That's right, the leftist students brought a Nazi to campus in 1963 as a free speech stunt. And they all dressed up in full, like, SS Nazi regalia to promote the event. No one shut down the man. There was no heckling of him even. They laughed politely when he was done making his remarks, and he went on his way. And no one was any worse for the wear, except probably they had gleaned some insights into how someone comes to hold these abhorrent views. Can you imagine if that happened on a college campus today? We would shut down the campus. There would be a day of national mourning. The mental health services would be busy for months to come. And of course, now we are, more than I don't know, we're 50 years removed from the threat of Nazism. This was less than 20 years after Nazis were an existential threat to life on the planet. And back then, they were so committed to free speech that they thought that was a useful way to show their commitment. So that shows you how things really have changed over the decades and have changed very suddenly, I think. So when I ask students about why they like these tactics or why they think shutting down someone like Charles Murray is a good idea, they would tell me that it is a matter of safety. They have, and this is the kind of thesis of my book, the expansion of the concept of safety is the dominant trend here, worth exploring, and I think a dangerous one. But they would say that if you are bringing someone to campus who is going to express views that make someone we're sympathetic to feel uncomfortable, then it is as if you have engaged in violence, because someone's mental health is a component of their overall health, and it lies on a related spectrum to their physical safety. So if you're bringing the speaker who's going to make people we're sympathetic to feel uncomfortable, it is as if you have thrown the first punch, and we are thus engaged in defensive violence to stop you, which I think is very interesting and again, very problematic, to use a phrase the left often uses. But is the ideology underlying many of these incidents that we've seen. So I tried to explore where this broader understanding of safetyism comes from. And one student I interviewed for the book, who is at Columbia now, he told me that, I asked him, what does safety mean to you? And he said, well, safety is my right to walk outside my home and feel affirmed in everything that I do. So but if authorities are required to provide you safety, and that is how you identify, that's how you describe safety, of course you would expect the powers that be on campus to shield you from speech that troubles you. And then I worry you would then, beyond the campus, you would expect the authority of the society, the government, or your employer, or et cetera, to also provide you that level of safety. And then we will quickly live in a world where it is impossible to have conversations, the kinds of conversations this school is trying to foster here, for instance. Because if someone feels bothered by it and it's influencing their emotional well-being, that would be an example of violence. The other trend I've identified in my book among progressive students that I think is also worrisome and kind of enhances or plays into this is intersectionality, which is the dominant trend in progressive activism. Intersectionality is a word that comes to us from the 1980s, from sociology. I think the concept in its basic formulation is correct. The person who came up with it was just trying to describe that, well, there are different sources of oppression in the world. People of color have been oppressed because of their race, women have been oppressed because of their sex, and so on and so on. And these things are different, but they relate and they stack. So you can be oppressed for more than one reason, and that's the entire revelation of intersectionality, which is kind of self-evidently true to me. However, in recent years, there have been added more and more categories of sort of marginalization that people are paying attention to on campuses. I can't recall if ASU has this. I suspect they do, but I could be wrong. A bias response team, many campuses, over 100, have had them, and they are They are reporting systems, and in some cases panels of people, to adjudicate harm, speech often, that infringes on a marginalized category, such as race, sex, gender identity, gender orientation, LGBT status, size, age, et cetera, on and on and on and on. Again, all of these things can be sources of oppression, but the movement of progressives on campus are often positioning the most oppressed person as the expert or the person who should be leading the protest or the collective action or whatever it is. And I've come to notice that people who are not actually oppressed at all are claiming a sort of mental health status as their oppression category. Because if you've been traumatized or you've been triggered or something, you can say, well, I have been oppressed and I have been marginalized and I have authority to command on these issues. And my book is actually full of examples of different categories of different people who belong to categories of conflicting oppression, arguing about who has the authority to weigh in on any given issue. I'll give you just one example. The Democratic Socialists of America, which is an organization I pay a lot of attention to, they were rolling out a Medicare for All campaign that immediately drew the ire of the Disability Caucus within the DSA, because they said, how dare you, the group at large, weigh in on this issue, because this is a health issue and we are the people who should have sole authority and power to pontificate on issues relating to health. And then the person who put out the Medicare for All proposal, I think, called them pathologically antisocial, and they said, well, how dare you, that's a marginalization, that's a microaggression for certain, and I think she was run out of the group. So adjudicating some of these conflicting claims of marginalization produce moments of comedy, but also moments that I think are serious setbacks for the left. I occasionally agree with the left, particularly on criminal justice reform. I would want them to be more successful than they have been. I think getting rid of things like mandatory minimum sentencing, like reforming how police treat people in this country are very important causes, and causes that can be bipartisan. But too many people on the other sides of these issues, on the left particularly, have framed it as, well, we don't want to work with you unless you agree on all of these other things that are required by intersectionality. I interviewed, for instance, a bunch of people about the Women's March from a few years ago, which I live in DC. I witnessed it. I thought it was one of the most impressive protests I've ever seen. There were hundreds of thousands of people there in DC. It is the most well-attended protest in decades. And if you were going to send a statement to Trump that his conduct toward women, or his alleged conduct, was reprehensible, I think this was a really powerful statement. Well, I talked to a number of activists for this book who said, no, I hated the Women's March. Again, who are activists on the left, who said, no, it was horrible. Like, well, why was it horrible? I said, well, it included people who don't agree with us. We only want to work with the most it didn't center the most marginalized in leadership. It didn't consult the most oppressed person. Was not the person organizing it. And I said, okay. I think if we have to get everyone on board with what you think, this is going to cause you problems down the road. I'm starting to run out of time, so I'll jump forward to some concluding thoughts of how we get out of this moment of shutdowns, of cancel culture, because I think it's not something that often requires actually the strong attention of government to do something. I'm always concerned that government will try to fix something and then it will make things worse because it's government. No offense to anyone here in government, but that does tend to happen. What we need is a sort of cultural change. We need to say that, no, we will not demand that you lose your job, or if people are calling for you to lose your job or be terminated or punished as a professor or be run off campus. The people who want that to happen, I really do believe, and based on my research for the book, can tell you as I think a certainty, are a minority. There's very few of them. Most people agree that this has gone way too far and we are becoming a less forgiving place where we are not willing to have difficult conversations, and we're not willing to let people fail and then forgive them and then move on with their lives. Professors need to feel affirmed by their administrations, I think, that I can disagree with my students, I can tell them they're wrong to do this thing, and I'm not going to be at risk of losing my job. And that would be a very easy thing to do for administrators to just say, yes, you have the academic freedom we've guaranteed you, we will not investigate you for this nonsense. For other students who object to the kind of tactics that I've outlined here, to stand up and say, no, I would actually like to hear this person. In fact, at one of the events I covered where there was a shutdown going on of a speaker, that's what stopped the mob, because one student stood up who happened to be a minority student who said, well, I think I disagree with this conservative speaker, but I would like to actually hear what they have to say so I can make up my own mind about it rather than have you make up my mind for me. And that robbed the mob of some of their power. Just to stand up and say that culturally this is not the place we want to head would I think be a very powerful statement. I mentioned Leif Olson, the Labor Department appointee at the beginning, who I was glad to see, because this was outrageous that he was accused of anti-Semitism, was defended not just by the right, but by many on the left. Vox.com, which is a well-to-the-left news website, published an article saying this was absolutely wrong. This Bloomberg law person should be ashamed of themselves. He is not an anti-Semite. And then today, just before I came here, I learned that it has worked, and he is going to be rehired as a member of the Labor Department. So calling out the cancelers can work. I have seen it work, and I encourage us all to be more bold in doing so. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Mr. Soave has kept brilliantly on time, so this is a demonstration that it's possible for liberty and order to be in, in harmony with each other. Just because my dean is here and listening, I'm all in favor of the proposition of my dean affirming me no matter what I do, not just on, not just on freedom of speech, but on other principles. So we now have quite a bit of time for questions from the audience. You'll see a microphone up here at the front. Good, we do have a student first, because we do have something, an informal rule at our events. We'd like to have students ask questions first. So please pose a brief question, which means it should be brief, and it should be in the form of a question. Thank you.
Will be some introduction, because I'm quite glad that you brought up the situation dealing with Ron Sullivan at Harvard. I'm intending on applying to law school for next fall, and it's something I've been paying attention to, because I'd like to study criminal justice and criminal law in the hope of being a defense attorney. And when you brought that up, I was thinking, to ask about some of your research. Do you think that some of these postmodern activists are posing a threat not only to our First Amendment jurisprudence and our free speech norms, but to the other criminal defense amendments that we have, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th, and the general norms of due process? Do you see that as a growing trend with your research?
I certainly do. I've been very wary of the left's change on due process in addition to free speech. I mostly talked about free speech, but on college campuses there have been now so many farcical tribunals for people accused of misconduct, often of sexual misconduct. This guidance, not entirely of a cultural origin, but actually explicitly because of guidance from the federal government beginning in 2011 under the Obama Education Department, explicitly told colleges they had to adjudicate sexual misconduct, particularly because of Title IX, that statute I alluded to earlier. It's one sentence long and just says, there can be no gender discrimination on campus, was interpreted to mean when there's a dispute between students, it must be adjudicated under procedures that are wildly unfriendly to accused students. I mean, they're so unfriendly to accused students that often the students have then sued the institution even when they were clearly guilty, and they win at court because when it goes to court, the judge says, oh my God, the schools can't do this. What were you thinking? And they said, well, that's what the Obama administration told us to do. So there was actually a legal component here that I'm glad I don't agree with everything the Trump administration does by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the things I do very much agree with them on was Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, rescinded this bad guidance. But the left, unfortunately, the student activists particularly, have been very bad on this issue, have been a very unfriendly to due process. Again, now the faculty of Harvard, the law faculty, has attempted to mount one of the most courageous stands against these trends imaginable. There's so many law professors there who have denounced what's going on with Ron Sullivan, with the guidance, et cetera. And again, they have been making exactly the kind of vocal case that I want more professors to be able to do. So thank you.
Your comment about having the government protect our free speech, what about social media, Google and Facebook? What is their role in making this worse, or how could they make it better?
That's an excellent question, and I touched briefly on the social media dimension of this. This is a trickier subject because the last thing I want to do is have the federal government tell Google or Facebook or Twitter or YouTube what they can and cannot put on their platform. That would explicitly violate the First Amendment because these are private companies and the government cannot tell them what kind of speech they can allow. That would actually be a violation of YouTube's free speech rights, or Google, or whatever the company is. They're big companies, but they're staffed by private citizens, so they cannot and should not be told what to do. I think there have certainly been cases of censorship of people, unwarranted actions by YouTube, for instance, to curtail videos on a selective basis where this is, for instance, if this is a conservative person, it's been taken off where it wouldn't have been taken off equivalent on the left. But many people are confused. They think these platforms are proactively discriminating against, many conservatives think these platforms are proactively discriminating against them. It's for the most part unintentional, because they don't do anything until someone complains. So someone complained about this video, and then they noticed it, and then they took it down. It's not that they're sort of proactively policing views they don't like or agree with. I want them to be, I think they should be more pro-speech, allowing more dissenting views, and I think they should be very clear about their rules, and they should tell you exactly what kind of conduct should be prohibited. But it's not the same thing as the university or the public square. For instance, these platforms prohibit doxing, which is, giving people's where they live or their phone number or something like that, just putting it out there, because that can result in death threats, harassment, actual violence. That's a kind of speech that I think the platform should absolutely censor, that would not be consistent with the public square. So there's some reason for these companies to have some restriction on speech. It's a thorny issue, but I would just be so careful about recommending the government do anything. And there's been bills, of course, Elizabeth Warren wants to regulate these companies. Senator Josh Hawley very much wants to regulate these companies as well, as a Republican senator. And I think these proposals are misguided for a variety of reasons. I also think it's short-sighted to think that the tech giants, they will always be with us forever, and they're monopolies, and we're doomed to only have this experience. I mean, I think that's short-sighted. I think the market is the best solution. If these companies are really bad, or they're turning off thousands and thousands of people who think they're censoring them, there is room in the market for competitors to emerge. That can happen. MySpace isn't around anymore. It was when I was a high schooler. These things, there's dynamic change in this industry that, and some people are saying, no, there's no way we could ever get around this. I don't think that's the case. So I think market solutions are better for this problem.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, Robby. My family and I had the pleasure of seeing you at Freedom Fest this past summer, and you're inspiring my young adult children, and so I appreciate that. My question is about your subtitle, specifically the age of Trump. Do you feel like this problem has come to a head because of the age of Trump? If so, why? Do you feel like it's getting worse? Has it always been there and I just haven't seen it? My generation's I'm a little older, but this just seems like a preposterous, huge problem, and it's frustrating to me. So why do you think it's become such a big issue, and does the age of Trump, what does that have to do with it?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you so much. So many of the phenomenon I was discussing or describing are things that predate Trump and were coming to a head that have nothing to do with Trump. The kind of safetyism coming home to roost, which I think a lot of that has roots in changing parenting norms, actually going back to the 90s, changing school norms. There's been a lot of, actually parents today can be arrested for letting their kids walk to school by themselves or play at the park by themselves. The kind of independence and resilience that young people used to develop is increasingly illegal, and I think that probably lends itself to thinking, the job of authority figures is to keep me safe, particularly in school. There's been so many policies to make students, I think, be more afraid of school or think it must be a very dangerous place. There's a police officer in the school now, and I hear about all these mass shootings, even though school has always been one of the safest places for kids, and crime has gone down dramatically since the 90s. I'm not even answering the question you asked. So why did I call it in the age of Trump? So the Trump component is that So any political contest inflames tensions on campus. So there would have been an increase in activism regardless of the situation. Obviously, because of who Trump is and Trump's style, I think he has set aflame the campus life in a way that no one else exactly would. There were, at many campuses, there were classes were canceled the day after the election. There were some campuses that didn't even cancel classes after 9/11. They kept canceling classes after Trump was elected. I think Trump as well is always with us because he's in the 24 news cycle constantly. It's hard to talk about anything else, and he has also positioned the media as his rival tribe. There's two tribes. You're in the Trump tribe, or you're in the media Democrat tribe, and you have to pick one or the other, and there's no room for anyone to sort of agree with Trump sometimes and disagree with him other times, as I do. It's increasingly hard to exist in any sort of middle ground based on what you hear from him and what you hear from the media. So this naturally bifurcates us and polarizes us if all of the incentives are to strongly identify with one or the other. And that's partly Trump's doing. Of course, the media tribe has, I think, often risen to the occasion of playing the role of sort of political enemy. Many people on CNN do that, I think, to a great degree. Trump has inspired them to do so, and they were willing to do it. So that is the Trump component of all this. And to some extent, these things were with us before, and they will be with us in the future, whatever comes. But if Joe Biden wins the nomination, this is my prediction, if Joe Biden wins the nomination and then loses to Trump, the kinds of progressive, woke students I've described will all say, aha, if only we had chosen as our nominee a true woke, sort of far-left progressive, then we would have won. So that will be like the worst case scenario for if you disagree with these tactics and these viewpoints.
In hopes of proposing a counterpoint or playing devil's advocate without proposing a whataboutism, I'd like to ask whether or not you think there's any strategies or tactics that perhaps more conservative people that are performing that are counterproductive. Because before this event, before you started speaking, I asked about Portland. I made a comment about Portland, and I feel, for as much as I despise communist militiants taking over a city, I really don't think bussing in conservative militiants to go ahead and butt heads and do some kind of Roman-style battle with them is productive either.
Yes, thank you for that. And I'm a libertarian. I'm often very skeptical of the police. I'm very critical of what the police do. But with the situation in Portland, where both sides seem to hate the police, the Antifa and the Patriot Prayer, Proud Boys, etc., and these two groups desperately want to beat each other up, and they both want to do that. And I hesitate to say it's the police's job to stop these two groups who really want to fight each other. Okay, you do you guys. I mean, I don't if it's just you and no one else is involved, I don't know why our public servants are obligated to deal with this. Certainly, if I were speaking for another half an hour, I would have talked about the related, almost equal and opposite trend in some conservative activism, young conservative activism. Of course, there's less of it on college campuses because they're wildly outnumbered, but there has certainly been an increasing trend over the same time period of young people on the right being far too willing to invite provocative speakers only because they want them to be shut down. And you actually see that in their internal discussions. I've done and seen reporting on that where they were like, who should we bring to campus? Well, who's the person that will trigger the left the most? There's actually even a saying for this. It's called owning the libs. Who will own the libs the most? And obviously that is, if that is your mentality, you are not at all making a good faith effort to foster healthy civil discussion between disagreeing sides. So, and also many on the young right have kept watch lists of professors on the left who've said anti-American things, or even taking videos of them in their classroom that are invasions of privacy and are invitations for them to get shut down the same way conservatives have. In my book, I talk a little bit about that, and I also conclude with a chapter because I'm writing about all the kind of new extreme movements I've seen that young people are likely to join. I conclude with a chapter on the alt-right, which is the most horrifying group of all, this group of explicit white nationalists, and I interviewed their leader, Richard Spencer, for the book. And he, interestingly enough, says he admires the identity politics of the left. He wants to take it to the next extreme, which is that white people should have their own group and their own everything in their own country, and everyone else should be run out of it. And it's abhorrent, terrible thinking. But the thing he hates the most, or the philosophy he's most against, is the philosophy of individual rights. He says, no, you don't have individual rights. Your rights come from your membership in a group. So I think certainly if he thinks that, which I think is terrible, we ought to be very skeptical of that claim that our rights come from our membership in groups. But I do talk about their rise, and I hope their fall, because I think they are receding in their influence. But certainly they as well are making social media a miserable place to inhabit, for not just for people on the left, but for conservatives who don't agree with them. So yes, there is a equal-ish problem on the right that certainly deserves our attention and our condemnation, and is not conducive to the kinds of conversations we want to be happening on campus.
Okay, since we still have a healthy line, could we have short questions and shorter
Okay,
answers so we maybe get through this group?
Yeah, that's my bad, guys.
I have a pretty good follow-up question to that, actually. So you just talked about all these radical people on both sides, in your answer there and in the talk. So what kind of strategies would you advise people use to nip it at the bud, keep this mob from having the power that it has before people get fired, before people get shut down?
The simplest answer I can say is the answer to bad speech is always more speech. So don't censor these people, even if we're talking about the alt-right. I'm actually even skeptical of kicking them off social media outlets, because in the couple cases where I've known of people who held really extreme, crazy ideas and came out of it, it was from increased exposure to these ideas and realizing these people are crazy. And there's been a couple good examples of that. There was one in the Washingtonian, one in the Washington Post, of people who were crazy extremists, and then they went further down the rabbit hole, and then they snapped out of it because they realized these arguments were bad. So more speech, more discussion.
So it seems like you kind of agree with the ACLU's point of view on free speech and civil liberties, at least in that regard. My question, though, is to what degree? Because, for instance, as they're referred to, I guess the Arizona 3, they would also be pointed out to in the ACLU website as having, the right to free speech, especially when it comes to cases like Brandenburg versus
So this
Ohio.
is the case of students at the University of Arizona who did not want a speaker coming on campus from the Border Patrol, part of a
Yes.
career day event at University of Arizona in the Springs, right? In April, March, April, something like that. And these 3 students were initially disciplined for shutting down speech of others. So
Right.
Yes, I wrote about this case, and I wrote that they should not suffer consequence for their activism. So I agree with the ACLU. I'm always reluctant to the point of thinking we almost never should do it unless the students are engaged in violence. I don't think they should be arrested, and I would favor for edge cases where they were disruptive. Again, the answer to bad speech is more speech. I would want them to maybe take a class or in the First Amendment history, or to have some sort of educational module for talking about these things rather than sanctions or punishment.
Okay, so you talked a lot about cancel culture in your speech. I'm actually someone who's been canceled in the past, and some of these things were for tweets that I made when I was 16 years old. What do we do in a culture where adolescents are not allowed to make mistakes, are not allowed to grow, and are being, basically these people will go up to my friends and say, you are associating with this person is bad, what am I supposed to do?
It is horrible what we are putting young people through these days. If a camera had followed me my entire adolescence and recorded everything I said or everything I wrote down, all of you, every person in the room has done or said something that would be embarrassing to them now. You probably forget you did it if you're 14 or even younger. Our social desire to shame and punish young people is really abhorrent to me, because the purpose of school in some respects is to socialize young people, they make mistakes, They learn why they were wrong. They make some kind of appropriate remedy. Maybe you clap erasers. Maybe you write a paper. Maybe you have detention or something. You're not shunned from society for the rest of your life. And then people will not apologize if we give them no opportunity for forgiveness. People who do something wrong should learn why it was wrong and be able to move on with their lives. And we are missing that component now. When I talk to young people, I warn them, because this is a reality. Be very careful what you say to anyone. I've written a lot of cases about youngsters who send inappropriate photos of themselves to each other. It's something like 70% of kids do, sorry. And I've seen cases of kids who are arrested for child pornography because they had a picture of themselves and they're underage, which of course is not what the statute on child pornography was designed to prevent at all. But their lives are ruined. They're on the sex offender registry for this. So I just tell young people, don't use your phones, don't do any of it, because you should be able to, but it's too dangerous. That's not a comforting answer, but until we move past this moment of, nope, you're on the hook for everything you ever said and did, it is just not safe to do any of that. So I'm sorry to hear about what happened to you. I've seen so many cases like you, and I can do little to correct it other than say it's terrible, and I wish more people thought the same way.
Hi there. So without relying on a kind of collection of extreme cases or your instincts that there are thousands more, how would you support the claim that professors feel more threatened by their students than, let's say, their administrations, for instance? Why are the administrations the ones that you expect to be affirming?
So it's not that I think, it's both are a threat. The method so the students are a threat because they're going to sick the administration on these professors in many cases. So I'm not saying the students are more of a problem than the administration. It's going hand in hand. I'm very careful not to draw, or I try to be careful at least, I'm sure I slip up from time to time, but to draw a quantitative I specifically do not phrase this as a crisis. I think it's a free speech problem on many campuses. A crisis would I think you'd have to support it with the idea that there's no campus where you're allowed to dissent and disagree. There are surveys of attitudes that young people hold toward the First Amendment, which do back up some of my broader concerns. There was one poll I cite in the book showing that current students were more likely than other groups, older people, younger people. Current students were more likely to say authority figures should prohibit hate speech, or to say that hate speech is not free speech. I heard that time and time again when I interviewed people. Polls show that large numbers of young people think hate speech is not free speech. This is an unfounded, this is an anti-legal idea, because there is no such thing as hate speech, or no court has never recognized a category of speech called hate speech. Hate speech is not one of the categories of speech that is exempt from First Amendment protection, in fact, which makes sense, because what is hateful to one group is truth to another. Hateful to certain religions would say, well, this speech is blasphemous, it's hateful, but others would take it as truth, et cetera, et cetera. So I do have in the book some surveys that I think hint at a broader problem. I try not to always make too much of them, because actually when you survey anyone of any age on what the First Amendment says and does, people give very bad answers, because people are often not well educated on public policy. That's not just young people, or even more so young people than old people. But there is, and one other study, though, that is worth looking at is the General Social Survey, which has shown young people on certain categories of speech saying a speech that is offensive, for instance, for racial reasons, a declining number of young people say, well, that speech should be protected. So that's a good example, I think.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you what is the primary cause for these young people to be turning over to these radical beliefs, and then further, what is the cause for them to develop a desire for these kind of radical actions?
I think most activists today are learning from other activists rather than from their teachers. The people I talk to would say, Which is funny because conservatives have this idea that like professors are brainwashing their students. Don't think it's quite true, because all the students I talked to said, I hate my professors, they're not nearly radical enough, I'm learning from other kids. Social media has allowed us to communicate with people across great distances, so people on one campus can learn what people on other campuses are doing. I think and also if you get like-minded people in a room and they're not in conversation with unlike-minded people, studies have shown that like the median view of the room will get more ideologically extreme as you try to be more extreme than the other people. So if you start out having people agree, this is one reason why it's important to always put yourself, or as much as you can reasonably do, in conversation with people who disagree with you. So you learn what the best arguments for the other side is. I've changed my mind about things. I think it's important and healthy if you do so. If you never hear what other people have to say, you're just listening to your own side. You risk making yourself more extreme in your views. Again, so I think exposure to more different views is better.
Let's say we're almost at our time limit. So lightning round. Ready? Lightning quick, lightning response.
All right, Robbie, I'm going to try to keep this short.
Okay.
As I told you earlier, I didn't finish reading your book, so if it's covered in there, I'm sorry. So, if safety is the thing that a lot of the students are thirsting for, and the news media is incentivized to promote like the biggest catastrophe because that's what sells, and yet we live in one of the safest times and places in human history. Yeah. How do you sell people on this idea that we live in one of the safest times and places in human history?
It's a real problem because things that happen are news and things that don't happen are not news. So everyone was fine. It was a good day. The clouds were pretty in the sky. There's no news story about that. No one's talking about that. Only bad things that happen. And of course, the way human memory works is that the more salacious something is, the more we remember it, the more we think that's going on more often. So more sort of media literacy, I guess, people contextualizing things they hear. Obviously, the media itself could train itself to be less sensationalist or searching for less sensationalism. And obviously this is a problem on the right as well. I think other people who've written about many of the issues I've written about, I'm occasionally quite critical of them for making it sound like it's a bigger problem than it is, that there's no such thing as a student interested in other ideas, that everyone is a snowflake. And I try to argue against them, maybe not as much as I can when I see those views presented.
What tactics do you think are appropriate for a campus protest? So obviously canceling, violence, totally inappropriate, but what do you think are good tactics? How do students protest positively?
It's a great question. Yes, I think students they have the right to protest. They should absolutely protest if they want to. They should protest before. They can protest during if their protest is not disrupting or preventing the event from taking place. I think you can boo. I don't think if they're interrupted once, it's a shutdown and you've done something wrong. No, you can boo, you can interrupt as long as the event is sort of allowed to proceed. So there's not like a hard and fast rule. Obviously, there will be some edge cases, but I think students can and should protest very vocally when they feel like it. Now,
so I'm going to interrupt. That's a good. So let's see if we can get
You're
these
right.
last
That's
three.
good. That's good.
I'm not booing.
No.
Yeah. So let's see if we can get 1, 2, 3 quickly.
Could you comment on the veneration of children nowadays, like Greta Thunberg or David Hogg? It seems like it's not just it's adults. In the past, there were young, youthful leaders, but the adults kind of poo-pooed them. Nowadays, it seems like the adults herald and venerate.
Yes, I've met most of the Parkland kids. I think they're all very interesting, thoughtful young people. Some of them are on the right, some of them are on the left. I'm interested in what they're doing. People like Greta as well. I think the danger for them is when movements put them on pedestals, that they're really not ready to step into that leadership position. And then because we live in a cancel culture, it invites people to look, well, what did they tweet when 10 years ago when they were 8? So if I were running a movement, I would, for the child's sake and the sake of my movement, I would be very reluctant to give undue authority to a young person, which is not to disdain young people, but they're still developing. All right, that's all we have time for on that.
I'm Gary Ellefson. First, thank you, Governor Ducey, and thank you to SCETL for hosting this talks. With the linguistics contortion here tonight, where commercial free speech, which I take to be the right to discriminate against others based on religious beliefs. And also thank you for your speech with much anecdotal evidence. Many topics, a broad spectrum. I'd like to think people losing their jobs for actions outside of work is not something new, but now it's with the social media, but is there any anecdotal evidence of someone being fired for their actions or views that is not in direct conflict for standards that that company supports?
Right, and also these are private companies, so I think companies have the right to fire employees. You know, I'm a libertarian, so I support their right to do that. My right, though, is to criticize it if it's for reasons that I think are unfounded, as was the case. It was not a private company, the government thing with the labor guy. You know, I criticized The Atlantic for firing Kevin Williamson, who's an arch-conservative writer who I disagree with all the time. But they hired him. They fired him the next week because someone on staff complained that it was an unsafe work environment because we have this person on staff. I think that's ridiculous, even though they have the right to do it. So they can do it. I'm going to criticize it. Yeah, okay.
Great. Earlier you said the situation you describe on campus is not a crisis and you don't represent it as such. And yet, in talking about some student demands at the University of Arizona, you described, you wrote an article with the headline of which was, "Freedom of Thought is on Life Support at the University of Arizona." And in describing this institution in your book, you responded to a mental health campaign aimed at helping students with anxieties and said, because of that mental health campaign, ASU was only sort of a college. Do you really believe that these student activists and this mental health campaign delegitimize our public universities in that way?
So I did not write the headline for that article. Little sort of journalist insider information. Usually someone else writes the headline, and yeah, the headline went too far in that case. I do not mean to demonize people who suffer from mental health problems. I think the destigmatization of mental health problems has been a very good thing. I'm glad that people who suffer from mental health problems have been able to get help, and there should certainly be campus resources for them. I do think it can be taken and has been taken too far. I interviewed a professor for this book who's a professor of theater who said every single student in her privileged liberal arts college at one point said they had post-traumatic stress disorder. There's no way. She had previously taught at a college where everyone had just come back from Afghanistan and none of them had PTSD. So clearly there's something going on if like the most privileged people are saying that anything that troubles them is infringing on their mental health. Now there are real issues. I agree with you. It's important not to go too far, but I think sometimes mental health has been a way to hammer at free speech that some student activists, not most people who suffer mental health problems, but some have used. And there's also evidence now, many studies, that the kinds of things that some students have demanded to protect mental health do not work. For instance, trigger warnings. There have now been 3 studies that show trigger warnings do not help and in fact might heighten the anxiety of the average student because you're preparing them to be alarmed and when in fact they wouldn't have been alarmed if you'd not used the trigger warning. Slate, a left of center outlet, wrote a headline saying, "Okay, I've changed my mind about trigger warnings, they're bad." Thank you.
Okay. So now, just as the governor said before, he stands between you and the speaker. I stand between you and the reception afterward, and there will be some time to ask Mr. Soave some questions, perhaps. So bear with me for just a few minutes to make some closing remarks and some thank yous. First, I hope everyone here will pick up some literature on the way out, as I mentioned about our courses, our curriculum. We have some unusual courses, including international experiences, a Shakespearean leadership seminar. We have 2 centers under the school, the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty, you can read about that, the Center for Political Thought and Leadership. And please spread the word, because as Michael Crow likes to believe, learners are of all ages now. We are universal learners, so learning never stops. Second, thank you to our terrific staff and faculty in the school who help us to put on and plan these kinds of events, especially Dr. Carol McNamara, who is our Associate Director for Public Programs, Catherine Sheffield, who is our Special Events Manager. You also saw Taylor and Bobby and JC and other staff members out there, and also our student workers. Thank you very much. And finally, again, we are grateful to the Goldwater Institute for being our partner for this event. We're grateful to Governor Ducey and for Dean Kenny for being here. We hope to see you at the next several events we have in the fall. I'm sure we'll hear a different point of view about the media and some of these issues from David Leonhardt of the New York Times. That's in October. But next up, we have Stanford University law professor and former federal judge here on September 17th for our annual Constitution Day lecture. That's Michael McConnell talking about the presidency and the Constitution. And then, as I mentioned, on September 25th, we have Harvard professor Robert Putnam here. So find out on our website about our whole schedule of events for the year. And with that, please stay for the reception. And please join me in one last thanks to Robby Soave.